Welcome everyone to our webinar, Afghanistan War Whistleblowers. I'm Chris Oppie, a historian at the University of Massachusetts and the director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. Tonight's event is part of our year-long series on public interest truth-telling. To see a full list of past and upcoming events, please go to our website, which is eipad.org, EIPAD.org. Our work is inspired by perhaps the most famous whistleblower in US history, Daniel Ellsberg, a former government official who in 1971 gave to the New York Times and 18 other newspapers a 7,000-page classified history of the Vietnam War that exposed more than 2 decades of government lies about the causes and conduct of the war. Those top secret documents were soon dubbed the Pentagon Papers. For that act of moral courage, Ellsberg was indicted on a dozen felony charges, some of them based on the deeply flawed Espionage Act of 1917, and he faced a possible sentence of 115 years in prison. The trial of Ellsberg and his co-defendant, Tony Russo, did not go to the jury because late in the trial, the judge had little choice but to dismiss the case against them when evidence surfaced from the Watergate investigations that the Nixon White House had committed crimes against Ellsberg in an effort to taint his reputation and to keep him from revealing any secrets he may have about Nixon. Since then, Ellsberg devoted the rest of his life to nonviolent activism on behalf of peace, truth-telling, nuclear disarmament, and First Amendment rights. He died last June at the age of 92. Dan was also a great supporter of other whistleblowers and often pointed out that truth-tellers do not act in a vacuum. They are greatly impacted by their times and are often inspired by other activists and truth-tellers, as he was. He often said, "Courage is contagious." He also made clear that we need to be more expansive in the way we think about whistleblowers. Unlike the referees of a basketball game who blow the whistle simply in order to preserve the rules of the game, many national security whistleblowers, like Ellsberg, seek fundamental changes in the way US foreign policy is conducted, and they understand that their acts of rebellion must be joined with the actions of many others to build movements for change. So let me now briefly introduce tonight's panelists. The discussion will be moderated by Kelly Vlahos. She is a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and the editorial director of its online magazine, Responsible Statecraft, where many of her own articles often appear. Previously, she served as executive editor, managing editor, and frequent writer on foreign policy at the American Conservative magazine. She was also a longtime online reporter for Fox News. Matthew Ho is the associate director of the Eisenhower Media Network. He is a former Marine Corps captain, an Afghanistan State Department officer, a disabled Iraq War veteran, and a senior fellow emeritus with the Center for International Policy. In 2009, Matt resigned his post with the State Department in Afghanistan in opposition to the war. In the chat, we'll post a link to his extraordinary letter of resignation. Daniel Davis is a senior fellow and military expert at Defense Priorities. He retired from the US Army as a lieutenant colonel after 21 years of active service, which included 4 combat zone deployments from Operation Desert Storm in 1991, Iraq in 2009, Afghanistan in 2005, and again in 2011. A few months after his retirement, he wrote an article for the Armed Forces Journal called Truth, Lies, and Afghanistan: How Military Leaders Have Let Us Down. We'll post a link to it in the chat. He has published numerous other articles for the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Guardian, and other publications. He is also host of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. Both Matthew Ho and Daniel Davis had the distinction of receiving the Ronald Ridenhour Prize for Truth-Telling, named after Ron Ridenhour, a veteran of the Vietnam War. During Ridenhour's tour of duty in Vietnam, he learned that a company of US infantry had killed hundreds of unarmed and unresisting civilians in a village called My Lai in 1968. When Ridenhour returned home, he had the moral courage to report what he had learned, effectively ending what had been a successful Army cover-up of the massacre that lasted some 18 months. The Ridenour Prize is a great honor, and we are honored to have all these guests with us. To those of you watching, if you have any questions, please do write them into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to some of them, particularly in the last half hour. With that, I happily turn it over to Kelly Vlahos.
Thank you, Christian. I really appreciate that opening, and welcome to all our viewers. It is a great honor to be leading this conversation for a program in the Ellsberg name, and I pledge to do my best to keep us living up to the ambitious and laudable goals of our discussion tonight. Fortunately, Dan and Matthew are some of the best examples we have in the 21st century of individuals who risk their careers and reputations to tell the truth about our post 9/11 wars. Each were confronted with a decision. Do I continue to do my job in the face of mistruths, half-truths, and flat-out lies by the US government, or do I sacrifice all to make a stand? In Matthew's case, he did the latter and resigned, freeing himself up to shout from the rooftops that US policy in Afghanistan was failing. After he left his post in the State Department in October 2009, he told reporters, "I feel that our strategies in Afghanistan are not pursuing goals that are worthy of sacrificing our young men and women or spending the billions that we're doing there," Ho said. "I believe," quote, "that the people we are fighting there are fighting us because we are occupying them, not for any ideological reasons, not because of any links to Al-Qaeda, not because of any fundamental hatred towards the West. The only reason they're fighting us is because we're occupying them," end quote. This was a big deal in October 2009. It was less than a year since Barack Obama took office and pledged to carry out a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan that would help restore security and a working democracy there, supposedly the good war. Ho had spent 6 years as a Marine in that good war and in Iraq as well, and knew that the failures that we were seeing on the surface were nothing compared to the fundamental problems with the invasion and occupation of both countries underneath. Meanwhile, Danny in 2012 wrote a report and subsequent articles outing US generals who were spin doctoring their way through the years to keep Congress happy and to keep continuing to send money, weapons, and troops into Afghanistan. Not to do something would have been to endanger the lives of the soldiers, Danny told me about his 2012 report and subsequent articles, as well as his classified brief that he delivered for Congress. It would have been unconscionable for me to keep quiet. That's how I want to look at everything. He said this as a working active duty lieutenant colonel in the Army. So again, sacrificing a lot in terms of his career, his prospects for promotions. He decided to put everything that he had seen in Afghanistan to paper. And in his report, in that 2012 report, he said, "Senior ranking US military leaders have so distorted the truth when communicating with the US Congress and American people in regards to conditions on the ground in Afghanistan that the truth has become unrecognizable. This deception has damaged America's credibility among both our allies and enemies, severely limiting our ability to reach a political solution to the war in Afghanistan. It has likely cost American taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars Congress might not otherwise have appropriated had it known the truth. And our senior leaders' behavior has almost certainly extended the duration of this war. The single greatest penalty our nation has suffered, however, has been that we have lost the blood, limbs, and lives of tens of thousands of American service members with little to no gain to our country as a consequence of this deception." Again, he wrote these words and had them published while he was active duty lieutenant colonel in the Army. And when I spoke to Danny after his retirement, he told me, quite frankly, that it was difficult for him to find employment because this is a company town right behind me. And you just don't go outside the lines like that. You don't drive off the reservation like Danny did without repercussions. So he did sacrifice all to make those truths public. 10 years after he wrote that, Craig Whitlock at the Washington Post released the Afghanistan papers, in which he was able to obtain the private interviews of numerous military and State Department officials by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, John Sopko. Those interviews, which were only released through the Freedom of Information Act, confirmed everything that both Matthew and Danny had said about the futility of the war policy in Afghanistan. But that was a full 10 years before, the public had access to these truths. I'd like to ask both of you, but before I want to read a quote here, because I think you'll find it very interesting, by Douglas Lute, a 3-star Army general who served as the White House's Afghanistan war czar during the Bush and Obama administration. He told Sopko during those interviews in 2015 that, quote, "We were devoid of fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. What are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. If the American people knew the magnitude of this dysfunction," 2,400 lives lost, Lute added, blaming the deaths of the U.S. military personnel on bureaucratic breakdowns among Congress, the Pentagon, and the State Department. Who will think that this was all in vain? So basically, that was just a few years after Danny and Matthew had made their decisions to risk all. So I would like to pose this question as my first question to the two of you. What were each of you thinking when Whitlock's award-winning series came out in the Washington Post? As whistleblowers, you paid the price for the truth-telling. Now here it was in black and white that you were right. Did you feel vindicated? Did you feel that your work and your sacrifice was worth it? That maybe it, sowed the seeds for the mainstream journalists at the Washington Post and other places to sort of pick up the ball and start asking questions and being more skeptical? What did you take from that all? I guess we can start with Danny.
Well, Matt and I've talked about this a lot of times, so I already know what he's going to say, and it's going to say no. There was no vindication whatsoever. Did we feel the slightest positive thing, because we were, number one, we always knew the truth, so it didn't tell us anything we didn't know, but it was anguishing that it took that long for the truth to come out, even though it was self-evident on the ground for anyone who was willing to look at it. There was nothing special about anything that I saw there that thousands of other people didn't see, but that too many people were either afraid to say anything or okay with just continuing on with the game, because that's, quote, how the game is played, and that's what you got to do to continue on. And most of the military people, for example, I knew that they just focused on whatever their task was. They were given a tactical task, and their deployment started on this day and it ended on that day. And between here and there, I'm going to do everything I can to take care of my men and do the job, and then I'll leave to policymakers, whatever else. And so they just didn't look up from that to see anything else or feel it was their job or anything to that regard. On the Whitlock papers themselves, I was not surprised either, but still very disappointed and discouraged and disheartened, because even when the truth came out, no consequence, no results, no changes, no anything. The war kept on going. And in fact, although there's plenty of complaints about the way President Biden got out, at least he got out, and I give him credit for that to this day. I've always given him credit for taking the hard choice to get out when he first came into office. But it took that long for us to finally get out. And then, of course, when the disaster unfolded in August 2021, and all the spin that had been hidden for all these years by all of this string of all these generals, I'll never forget the one in 2013. His name Matt? Who was the guy that 2013, the commander, the Marine Corps general?
John Allen.
Allen, yeah, said that we won. This is victory. This is what victory looks like. And it was a lie from the beginning.
Right.
And then when the thing's over, who do they ask what went wrong? But the very architects of the people who made the policies. And so not only was no one ever held accountable, they actually went back to the architects of the disaster to explain to the rest of us why it went wrong. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, they said it was somebody else's fault. If they'd just done what I said, everything would have been fine or whatever. And it's Biden's fault. It's whatever. Trump, some blamed him. But the bottom line is that this disastrous war, all the things that Matt told, and he was my predecessor. He's the one that I modeled my things after. Like I think you mentioned in the beginning here, he was inspired me to do this, to follow in his footsteps. And yet you see that no one was ever held accountable. And now that, as I actually had on a show just hours ago on my new channel, this is still going on to this day. And I was talking specifically about lies, intentional deception, and just hideous analytic ability at a highest levels of government is drawing us further and further into two potential wars that we may end up fighting because we're not willing to tell the truth. So it's kind of a long answer, but yeah, it's kind of discouraging.
Matt?
Yeah, I think, exactly as Danny said. And, there's a third person. I remember we did a show with Scott Horton immediately that day that these came out. Danny, myself, and another dissident named Danny Surgeon. And Scott, of course, had been talking about the Afghan war in the same manner we have been talking about it before we went even public. So Scott's been a great I don't want we want to call Scott an anti-war voice, since even though he is the anti-war guy, but his foreign policy understanding is so great, eclipses most people in DC. But I think there also was too, since this is about whistleblowers, so I think we're probably a little more comfortable here getting into some personal stuff than we normally would. I think there was an anger when they came out, and a sense of disappointment. The fact that nobody picked up the phone and asked us, 10 years before Whitlock publishes these papers in the Washington Post, for which they had to go to court for like 3 years, a major legal battle to secure these papers.
Yes.
10 years before, I had been on the front page of the Washington Post. And when I asked Karen DeYoung, who wrote the story on me, why'd you do this? Why'd you write this? It's like a 3,500 word expose on me on everything. And this is back in the day when people actually read newspapers. So for folks who remember, I was above the fold, it was a big deal. And right. I mean, and for then those 10 years go by. Oh, when I said, Karen, why did you write this? She said, because everyone I spoke to at the Pentagon, at the NSC, at the State Department, the CIA, they all agreed with what you were saying about the Afghan war. And I'm pretty sure that was Danny's experience with Scott Shane at the New York Times, when Scott Shane wrote that front page expose on Danny's dissidence, on his willingness to go to Congress and say, the generals are lying to you about this war. And then over those period of years, the Washington Post and the New York Times never contacted us. I've never had anything published in the Washington Post since then. And Danny, I think the same for you as the New York Times, right? I mean, so I don't want this to mean, oh, poor Matt, poor Danny, right? That's not what I'm getting at, but it just shows how the system is. And even if you are right, they are not, and even if they're going to use you for their ratings or purposes to publish a big front page story, they are not going to come back to you and ask your opinion again. And then when they publish,
if I could just say, and meanwhile, you have all of these guys who are desperately wrong all the time, routinely on the op-ed pages of the Washington Post and New York Times. Just need to throw that in there.
Yep, exactly. So I think one aspect of that revelation for us was that anger, as well as that continuing disappointment. I'll also say something. You brought up Doug Loop before, and there was, Washington, D.C., everyone accepted this bright, shining lie that the war was doomed to failure. And Lute, there was a great example about Doug Lute, because as you said, Doug Lute was Bush's war czar. And then he stayed on as a 3-star general, right, and became Obama's war czar. And then he stayed on past any amount of time where people would have said, where people were saying, hey, how come Doug Lute hasn't rotated out yet? How come he's still there? Because usually generals don't stay in those positions for more than a year and a half. Lute was in it for, I think, 4.5 years, if I remember right. And how come he stayed so long? And the story that circulated around Washington, D.C., that to everything I know is credible, was that no one would take the job, right? Because this job is, do you want to be the person holding the wars in front of the president, these failing, unwinnable wars that are counterproductive? And so just that should have been an alert to everybody of how badly these wars are, because normally you would think that the line of generals and admirals would be going from the White House door all the way to the Potomac, lined up to be the president's war czar, right? But these wars were so doomed that they were so counterproductive, and they were based on based upon lies, that no one wanted that position, and so Lute stayed on.
Yeah, I mean, you both talked about the lack of consequences and accountability for those who are responsible for all these failures. It is an unfortunate truth in this town that those who call attention to those failures, which would be you both and myself, Scott Horton, a number of other friends and acquaintances of ours over the years, do feel consequences, and usually those consequences mean harm to your career trajectory. And it's unfortunate. You, like I said in my opening, you really do have to make a clear decision about whether or not you are ready to sacrifice some piece of yourself, whether it be your career or your reputation in town. When you do make that ultimate decision to go against the grain, to question the authority or the conventional wisdom of Washington, and you're not rewarded for it. You're not rewarded for it at all. You will be in your heart and with the friends you make, and knowing that you're doing the right thing. But like you said, I mean, for what you did, you should have been a consultant, each of you, as the country was moving towards the withdrawal stage of that war, all through Obama and then Trump. And yet you had to basically find your own spaces to keep working, to keep getting the word out. And I too, as a reporter in this zone, first writing for American Conservative, and then antiwar.com, and then American Conservative again, and wherever anybody would have me, I felt marginalized as well. I mean, you make a decision. And that's why I love the fact that now I'm doing all this work at the Responsible Statecraft, and you're all doing your work at the Eisenhower Network and Deep Dive, where you're actually reaching a lot of people. And what you're doing is you're platforming other people so that they're not cast in the margins. And I think that we've kind of, it's not sour grapes to say, oh, great, I've only been saying that for 10 years. And all of a sudden, Craig Whitlock is getting all these awards. Now, I'm not saying he didn't do the gumshoeing to get that story. Like you said, he had to fight in court and everything. It's not sour grapes. It's just, it's bemoaning the fact that the system is stacked, and that usually we end up being canaries in the coal mine, and then other people, get the
Kelly, when I came back from Afghanistan, I want to say it was late October 2011 is when my deployment ended. And I think I'd been talking to Matt about this on email before I'd gotten back, and we met together, and I told him that my conscience was just not allowing me to sleep, and I think I'm going to have to come out and do something public. And from somebody who had already done this, I always so valued his comment, because he told me gut level what I was facing. He said, if you do this, these bad things could happen. It could go this direction. We've had some other friends, some mutual friends, who actually went to jail because of some of these things, that they found reasons to put them in jail, etc. He said, you're going to be ostracized. You can forget about getting promoted, anything else in your career, if you don't also maybe have some negative things happen to you. And he said, you got to make sure you're sober on this. It's not like Obama's going to change policies. Probably nothing's going to happen because of this. So if you understand all of that, then we will do everything. And there was several other people we will do everything we can to help you and prepare you for this, but you need to be sober-minded about what's coming in. He didn't say anything about you'll get a big job, you'll get, any kind of good
You'll have
stuff,
a
whatever.
ticker tape
He was all
parade.
full of it. And man, was he good to his word, because Matt's been one of the best friends I've ever had in my life. And, and he's still here with you to this day. And of course, as you said, that's more valuable than any of the other things. But it is sober that anyone thinking about doing this needs to understand there's no cheering crowds. There's no good stuff, but it's something that must be done.
If people are familiar with the television show Mad Men, there's a part of that series where the protagonist, Don Draper, receives accolades for going against the tobacco companies. And he's getting a big award from the American Cancer Society or Heart Association or somebody, a big deal. And he's leaving the office with his buddy, Roger. And he says, "Oh, hang on. I don't have any business cards on me. Let me go grab some." And Roger says, what do you need those for? And he says, "Because I'm getting this big award. I'm handing out lots of cards." And Roger says, No, you're not. These people are giving you an award. They're not going to hire you. You're not a yes man. You're getting an award for not being a yes man. Nobody is going to hire you because you're not a yes man. Paraphrase the scene. But that's essentially what you come up against. And you come up against it, in a host of different ways. In a sense that it's not just whistleblowers, Danny and I, military type whistleblowers, but you see this across the entire whistleblower community, wherever people are coming out of, whether it's USDA, whether it's TSA, whistleblowers across the board, they have a lot of difficulty finding employment afterwards because people Google them and then it's, hey, this guy or this gal, these aren't yes people. They're not going to toe the line when we need them to. Where is their loyalty towards? As well as, too, the other aspect of this then is for whistleblowers, there are very severe mental and emotional costs to this. Most whistleblowers end up having some type of mental or emotional health issue that has something to do with their whistleblowing. We've seen this over and over again. So not only do you have amazing people who did just incredible work in the government who then blew the whistle because things were wrong, and now they're working at Hobby Lobby or in the Apple Store. Nothing against that, but these are people who came from the highest levels of government. Yeah. And now they're working retail because that's all they can find. At the same time, too, they're dealing with that dissonance that's occurring of, yes, I was right, I did the right thing, and now I'm being punished for it. As well as then the deafening silence from those who they were with, who are supporting them privately, but then, of course, are not able to support them publicly.
I'm looking at both of you, and I've known you for many years now. And I don't even know how many years, but at least over a decade, right? Can we say that? You both look fantastic. You both come off quite or naturally like you're on the top of your game, respectfully. I know, Matthew, you've had a lot of issues, like you mentioned, mental health issues. I think I read in your bio that you had been diagnosed with traumatic brain injury. I've written quite a bit about that, and know something about it, and my heart goes out to you. Danny, I don't know too much about like how you dealt with all of the aftermath immediately. But I can imagine that it wasn't easy for you either. Yeah. But both of you are there, and now you are, you've lived through the Afghanistan war, the withdrawal. We have a war in Ukraine, where there a conflict in Gaza right now that that the United States is supporting and sending weapons into. I guess my first question is, how did you get through all of the turmoil, the personal turmoil, and the raw, I guess, backlash that I'm sure came with a lot of the accolades as well? And how did you it seems like you both have maintained a core in which you're in great fighting condition to go out there and say, these are our principles. And right now, the United States is not acting in the best interests of the United States in Ukraine or in Gaza or any of these other overseas operations and interventions. Like how have you maintained that core? And do you have a special, I don't want to say recipe, but maybe you can share with each of us how you have come through all of this to fight another day.
Yeah, I was, as you mentioned a second ago, I was still at active duty. This wasn't after I resigned or anything. So I still had to go to work the next day. And I was under more stress and pressure than you can imagine, especially in the days and then the hours leading up to when I finally came clean, because I went and first told some of the generals privately before anybody knew publicly, and so I knew I wasn't going to have any top cover for a while, and took a lot of heat internally. But I was stationed in the Pentagon, and I was a liaison officer between the Rapid Equipping Force, which was at Fort Belvoir, and the senior leaders of the Army in the Pentagon. So my job was actually to liaise with the generals and stuff who were the last men on the planet that wanted to have anything to do with me. And I'll never forget in the first period of time afterwards, all my coworkers, everyone was afraid to even talk to me, to be seen. And one day, I guess the first full week, nobody did talk to me, and the generals didn't talk to me. They didn't even let me work. I just had to sit at my desk and be there for 8 hours. No one was talking to me. And then the second week, I'll never forget, this one guy comes up to me, and he kind of, just walking around, and you could tell as he's coming up, he checks, make sure no one's watching. And he goes, "Hey man," he goes, "you just said out loud what all of us are thinking. Good job." And then runs away. He took off because he didn't want to get tagged in with me or whatever. And it was pretty miserable because Matt and several others, like Tony Schaefer, and a couple of other people had really done good things to set me up and introduce me to members of both the House and the Senate, Republicans, Democrats. I had a lot of top cover, so the Army couldn't come after me because I was been really careful not to be, like some of these others who did things illegal and gave away illegal classified information. I went by the book to make sure I didn't violate any laws, so they couldn't come after me, but they could make life just miserable for me to live. And finally, about 3 or 4 months later, we found a mutual job elsewhere in Washington outside the Pentagon that was kind of like made them happy because they didn't have to see my face anymore. And certainly made me happy that I was outside of that pressure. But for 3 months, it was just hell on earth to go into work every day.
Yeah, when I had a lot of support when I was resigning. So in terms of Afghanistan, the other political officers like me, the Americans throughout the country, I had support from, most of them. I know I had support from my counterparts who were in the 6 most violent provinces in Afghanistan. I remember flying up to Kabul and running into 2 of them on the way up there. And one was from Kandahar and the other was from Uruzgan. And they were both delighted that I was resigning and agreeing with everything I was saying. And if I, when this is similar to what you heard from Manel Sheline when she resigned from the State Department last week, that her counterparts are so supportive of her resignation and that they can't do it themselves because of the golden handcuffs, right? So if I heard that once, I heard it 100 times. I wish I could have done what you did, but I've got 2 kids going to college. But then it just expands from there, where the people who were supportive, it was anyone who seemed to know anything about Afghanistan was in agreement with what I was saying. Again, to what Karen DeYoung said when she started asking around, and that creates but then nothing changes and no one else speaks out. I had become friends with the gentleman whose last duty station with the State Department was at NATO headquarters. So he was the U.S. State Department's political advisor to NATO. And Jack was saying that when General McChrystal's plan in the summer of 2009 went around NATO headquarters to escalate the war, nobody agreed with it. But when it came time to initial and send it on to the next office, everyone did it. So you saw that happen over and over again. And then also what I got confronted with as well was because both Ambassador Eikenberry, who was the American ambassador to Afghanistan, who had also been a three-star general in charge of the war at one point, as well as Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who was the president's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, made very clear to me that everything you're saying is correct. I agree with you, but you're not getting it. This is a political decision. And so when Holbrooke and Eikenberry would be in the briefing room with President Obama discussing whether or not to escalate that war in 2009, neither one of them were able to speak because the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, thought that what was best for domestic political reasons was for the Democratic Party to be seen as being better at fighting wars than the Republican Party. And you could see this, certainly when David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel recommend to President Obama to escalate the drone campaign because it would make him look tougher.
Yep.
Right. So, you could have all this agreement with you on your level, but then what you run head into is the very practical reality of Washington, D.C., that politics determines everything. That there is a reason why it goes tactical, operational, strategic, and political in terms of the levels of war. And so just as what you learned, if you didn't know it already, was that loyalty is the most prized possession in Washington, D.C., as we've been discussing, right? Because you are, you're not a yes man. The other aspect of that as well is that, yes, indeed, the political level is the most important. It's the most important level of warfare, and it is the defining level of warfare. That's where the decisions are made. Everything else below that, you take it or leave it. But in terms of what's going to decide the course of the war, those are all purely political decisions.
This is getting a little depressing because everything you are saying is absolutely correct. But I'd like to put a little spin on it. I'd like to think that collectively what you were doing, Matthew, and have been doing ever since your resignation, and everything you've been doing on your end, Daniel, which is really, I think, speaking to a more conservative audience, a more military-friendly audience, being a sort of champion for all of those military, active and retired individuals who agreed with you but didn't know how to express it. Collectively, the things that have been written, other whistleblowers, veterans speaking out, had sort of kind of worked its way through the American bloodstream, because by the time Donald Trump was running for office in 2016, he felt comfortable calling out the failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and saying, let's get our boys out of there. And he had a lot of support, and particularly from military quarters and military families who were tired of the constant tempo of deployment, and then meshing that with, the anti-war groups on the left that had been toiling away. And I feel like he was able to harness what really was a popular revolt against the war. And then it became a political imperative to get out. And so I credit like you both with being part of that firmament that led to the popular disillusionment and disenchantment. I feel like up to that point, it was like, well, the Congress and the White House would continue to fund it and carry it out as long as they possibly could. But it wasn't until the people turned against it. And I realized it took a long time. But I do feel like if we're going to see a silver lining here, it's like, I think it starts with 1 or 2 resignations and whistleblowers to actually kind of infect, the public discourse. And I'm hoping that you're continuing to do that today. I'm glad to see Anel and Josh Paul have both made tremendous sacrifices quitting their jobs. Would you, either of you, give them any advice right now on what to expect, or what would you say to them if they were on the show right now?
Let me just follow up what we were saying and follow up on what I was saying
Yeah.
about the politics of it, because it isn't as depressing or as demoralizing as it may sound. And actually, there is a silver lining in it,
Yeah.
and that the politics do matter. And that people may say, hey, the peace movement, the anti-war movement hasn't done anything in the last 20 years. And that's simply not true. I mean, you look at the 2006 midterms, that was all about the Iraq War. Well, also about the Republican corruption, but it was about the Iraq War. 2008, Obama wins election over Hillary Clinton and then over John McCain because of the Iraq War. 2010, 2012, we're in the Great Recession. 10 million people are losing their homes. It's understandable. But even too, in 2012, Afghanistan is not Afghanistan is not on the ballot because Obama has already said we're getting out, right? He already said that we're getting out, and Romney is on the same page as him. So what you see happen is you see both political parties, because this is what the Republicans do in 2008. This is why George W. Bush in the summer of 2008 signs that status of forces agreement with Iraq to get U.S. troops out of Iraq within 3 years in order to try and protect John McCain's campaign, right? To try and take Iraq out of the 2008 election. It doesn't work. But Obama and his campaign in 2012, again, 10 million people losing their homes, a lot of other things going on, are able to argue that we're leaving Afghanistan. We're drawing down. This is not an issue for the war to be debated. But what you see happen, though, is because of the political effect of these wars, the U.S. military, the U.S. empire, changes how it fights these wars. So the idea of having large amounts of ground forces where the United States is going to sustain casualties like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, by the second half of Obama's presidency, that is done. That is not politically possible. Right. And then, of course, 2016, Kelly, as you said, there's a lot of really great evidence out there. I believe it's Harvard and both Minnesota have done research on the anti-war consequences for the 2016 election. And if you look at the counties in the United States that had the highest disproportionate rate of casualties from the Iraq and Afghan wars, those counties went for Trump in a way that can't be explained in any other way except for anti-war sentiment. And those counties were enough to give Trump the election in 2016, right? So you see this political kryptonite that large amounts of ground troops and casualties become because of the political consequences. So if we understand that, we can utilize that. But I'll also say we have to understand that what does the empire do? What does the U.S. government do? They evolve. Right? They adapt. So they switch to proxy wars. They use drones and special operations. They outsource it to contractors, right? They keep it so they use proxy forces. They keep it so that there aren't those political costs from the wars felt here domestically.
Yeah, and if I might add to that, and this might be a little provocative, is that they hyper politicize the wars. So as you're hearing now from Biden, that if you don't consider Putin a evil Hitler-like figure who is threatening the very idea of freedom and liberty across the globe, then you are MAGA. You have an authoritarian impulse that you're on the wrong side of history. He's lumping everybody in to that, orange man bad. And that prevents the anti-war movement, non-interventionist realism and restraint, whatever you want to call it, from building a bigger tent. Because if you're on the left and you go, I don't want to be associated with MAGA or Trump, I don't like him, and I'm afraid to talk out about what I'm seeing in Ukraine right now because I don't want to be called pro-Putin, that's pretty effective. I feel like that. I just feel like the hyper politicization, where you are on the political spectrum defines where you should be on foreign policy or these wars. That keeps us divided.
Right. And that's an example of the evolution that we were talking about, where the previous way that you use to quash dissent, to silence opposition would be you don't support the troops. Right. But if you don't have troops there, you can't say that.
Right.
So, then it becomes, well, it becomes an aspect of identity politics, right? Where, okay, if you don't support this, then you and your party are with this foreign adversary.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and it is. It's effective.
And I'll just tell you also that, as I mentioned a minute ago on our show just a little while ago, I'm really hot about this right now, which is why I'm mentioning it again, is that the same tactics that have been used all during the time of the Afghanistan war that we were talking about are still being used here, even if a different means. They're lying. They keep telling you. I've lost track of the time I saw senior government officials lie to the American people and tell them Ukraine can win. Ukraine is winning. Ukraine did win. They succeeded. It was never true. Just like it was never true in Afghanistan, it's not true now. And for this whole thing that Biden keeps saying, I've heard Schumer say it, I've heard McConnell say it, we need to give them this $60 billion. That's the only thing holding them back. No, it's not. It has nothing to do with the outcome. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the dynamics between two sides and what goes into making national combat power. It's a little drop in the bucket, but they're lying to you and saying it matters. It matters between victory and failure, even though, as Matt and I have actually talked about on our show a few times, they never say how. They never say, if we get that money, then this and the other thing will happen, and we'll negate this from Russia, that from Russia, that they have this big advantage on. They don't even do that. They don't bother with it. They stick with what you just said a second ago, which is the emotional comment. And it's the Putin is a dictator and he's coming for us. That's the other thing they say a lot. Even though militarily, Putin has no capacity to come after anybody in NATO, and he doesn't even have the desire for it. He has other objectives that he wants, which is why he went to war. But coming after NATO is not one of them because he's not suicidal. But that doesn't keep our people from saying things they know are untrue. So the lies keep going. And I just don't know what the American people are supposed to make of it. But that's why Matt and I and you and several others that are responsible statecraft keep on telling the truth.
Well, and that's what I would say. You asked Kelly before I pulled this down this rabbit hole. You asked about what we would say to Josh Paul or an LG line, and of course it would say thank you, and then it also be cognizant of how you're doing. This gets back to also to what we were talking about before about the emotional and mental health aspects of this. Be cognizant of what you're doing, of what you're up against. You are up against the Leviathan. It is your lone voice screaming into the whirlwind, right? And the consequences for you can be devastating, particularly 6 months, a year from now, when everyone has moved on. So right now, Josh and Anel, they're getting a lot of media attention, very well deserved. I'm really excited to see that. But 6 months from now, a year from now, when the world has moved on, when the television networks have moved on, and you no longer have that job, you start to question why you did this. You start to wonder whether it was worth it. But also, too, it's not even that. It's more of the dissonance that you were right. The world has shown that you were right, and now here you are. Where is everybody? So that's what I would say to them is be ready for that and be cognizant of that. And in strength, and as Danny was just implying, these people who've gone before you, who've done this, the folks who are your allies, lean on them and utilize them, to help you get through those tough times, because that's what you asked, what helped for me. That helped me in a lot of ways, was help with the fellowship, the solidarity I got from other people. Danny, I'll tell you this, when we're both Ridenhour prize winners, whenever you go to a Ridenhour prize ceremony, an award ceremony, it's like going to this massive, incredible group therapy. It is so rejuvenating,
really is, man.
right? So you find those to be in solidarity with, find those who also understand what has occurred, find those like Tom Drake and John Kiriakou, Daniel Hale, support them where they're at, and they in turn will support you. It's that type of thing I would say to Josh and to Anel, and to anybody who's watching this or listening and who are contemplating blowing the whistle. There are people out there who will help you and gladly help you.
That's very important. I would say, having been in Washington for, I think it's 25 years now, it becomes a small town, and there are plenty of people, we all know each other, who would give their left arm for you guys because they love you so much and what you did for the country, and they don't forget. And I hope they're always constantly reaching out to you to reaffirm that, because you know, you mentioned John Kiriakou. He's another one. I mean, he he went to prison for blowing the whistle on torture and waterboarding, and he had to rebuild his life. Here's a guy who was a CIA officer, multi degrees, top of the world in terms of his government position and status, and nobody would give him a job when he came out. Not only was he an ex-con, but he was a whistleblower. I think each of you have great reserves of fortitude, or else you wouldn't have been able to come through it. And John is no different. Tom Drake, another one, which I just have so much regard for. I'm just gonna remind our viewers, please, if you have questions, you can bring them into the Q&A rather than the chat. So then we can like discern them from, you know, the back and forth and the conversation that people are having right now.
By the way, Kelly, I don't want to leave that section there
Sure.
without saying Danielle Bryan is also
Oh,
like
yes.
the top of the list of supporters
Yes.
that I couldn't have done this without. And I know Matt's the same. She's been a close friend of ours and just a wonderful human being and a great American that I have admired for decades.
Yeah. And she's
Right.
kind of like a den mother for all of the all of us misfits, you know?
Yeah,
A
and
den
it's
mother, I like that.
this dissonance that we're talking about, this I shouldn't even use that term, this moral and intellectual dishonesty that we see throughout DC and throughout the American media, it still exists. Daniel Hale just got out of prison. Daniel, the day he got out of prison for mishandling classified information as well as for Espionage Act was the day that Special Counsel Robert Hur said, I'm not going to charge President Biden under the Espionage Act or mishandling classified information because of his intent, right? It doesn't seem to me like he had bad intent in any of this, right? Daniel, of course, drone whistleblower, his intention was to tell the world about what the Americans were doing with their drone policies, with their drone campaigns, which were absolutely brutal, killing thousands of civilians. Daniel released this information at the same time, at the time that the Obama administration was claiming we were not killing any civilians with our drones. John Brennan would go on CNN and say we're not killing any civilians with our drones, and then CNN would hire him. And so Daniel gets out of prison for telling the world about this, telling the world that 90% of during one 5-month-long campaign in Afghanistan, a drone campaign in Afghanistan, 90% of the people we killed with our drones were civilians. Right, we can go through on these numbers over and over again, and so clear public interest, showing clear, you know, just not just a failure of policy, but also wrongdoing. Daniel writes an op-ed, terrific op-ed after he gets out of prison, right? And no one will publish it. We pitch it to the Washington Post, we pitch it to the New York Times, they say no. The Hill says to us, oh, we like this, but we're not sure what we could do with it. Right? He could publish it. Al Jazeera published it, but like we could not get anyone to publish this from this young man who had just gone to prison for telling the world about the illegality and the failure of the American drone campaign. I mean, so it's like getting hit with a
that's what I want.
shovel.
Okay, let's. Sorry, but you did a little rabbit hole down there. I've wondered since you know. So he exposed what happened. Whether he crossed the line or not, that's a separate issue. But that he talked about the truth and that people were responsible for innocent people being killed. Where are those people being? Where's their judgment? Where is their being brought up on trial and being sent to prison like this guy did? I want to see that too. What happened with all that part?
Well, and I think that's what also is another aspect of why we have these issues, right? This dissonance that exists within us between what we know and what we see happening is that the people that carried out these policies, they've been promoted, right? So if you look at those who were in charge of the American war policies today, the people who are guiding American policies when it comes to Palestine and Israel, or guiding American policies when it comes to Ukraine, these are the same people, the same men and women that were in charge of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Africa, right? I mean, like, so you have that how is this possible? You know, you struggle to find the right words to express what you are witnessing, what you've lived through. So people that promoted wars that were built and sustained upon lies, that were clear failures, you know, not just moral wrongs, but not just failures, but counterproductive. My favorite Afghan stat is that when the U.S. invades Afghanistan in 2001, there are roughly 200 to 400 Al-Qaeda worldwide, according to the FBI, right? Worldwide, you know, and what does our invasion do?
Oh.
Right? You know, I mean, it creates Al-Qaeda into an international organization of tens of thousands that has offshoots like the Islamic State. They control vast amounts of land. They control cities like Raqqa and Mosul. They threaten governments. And yet, before we invaded Afghanistan, there are 200 to 400 people strong worldwide, according to our own FBI. You know what I mean? So it massively counterproductive. Massively counterproductive. And every one of those wars has at least one incredible example like that and many other smaller examples. You know, and yet these people are promoted. They're the ones in charge of these, while people like Daniel Hale are in prison, John Kiriakou is in prison, Tom Drake is, you know, working at the Apple store, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, and you're making me angry because I'm starting to remember stories that I did during this time,
Right.
particularly about Abu Ghraib. So we
Yeah.
have
Oh,
an
yeah.
example of actual law breaking in terms of torturing detainees. We have it. We have all the pictures. We have all the documents. We know that the policy was put into place at the very top to torture detainees, and yet none of those people were held accountable except for a few very low
Low-ranking people.
level
Yeah.
National Guardsmen, and Janice Karpinski, who was the brigadier general at the time of at the jail. Again, another you know, who was literally sort of thrown into a situation where she was told basically by CIA that were there, contractors were there, her top commanding officers, that this was the policy, and she ended up getting demoted, but nobody above her. And same with the torture, the CIA torture. Senate did a massive investigation, found out there was torture. Obama comes out and he says it's never going to happen again, and nobody was punished for it.
Well, you know, and the other aspect of this too is in the conduct of the war, the actual operations of the war, the strategy of the war. When you have those lies at the senior level, it creates an impossibility for those who are actually conducting the war to have a successful strategy. And so when we're in Iraq, in the early years of Iraq, and it's literally forbidden by the Secretary of Defense to use the term occupation. How are you going to win a counterinsurgency fight? How are you going to win a war against guerrilla forces, beat a resistance, if you can't even say out loud that you are an occupying power? In the same way, too, the same thing occurred in Afghanistan. The same thing occurred, you know, in terms of whether or not we were occupying, you know, whether we were seen as occupiers or whether there was a civil war. You just weren't allowed to say those things. I mean, if I went to one briefing, I went to however many of, you know, an intel briefing that shows the insurgency, right? And then it lists what their reasons are for attacking us. And it's, you know, never listed that maybe they're attacking us because we're occupying them. Maybe this actually is a national liberation front. And so when you don't understand that, right, when you refuse to acknowledge that the Taliban actually has support among the people as a liberation army, or when you are forced to go along with the lie with that Sunni insurgency in Iraq is entirely composed of Al-Qaeda and there's no nationalist elements within that, when point of fact is we knew it was like 96, 97% nationalist and only about 3% jihadist. But so what does that do then for your strategy? How do you actually conduct operations? You are committing yourself to losing that war when you're not even allowed to say out loud what the war actually is, right?
And of course, we're continuing the same thing today in both the Israeli-Hamas war and in the Russia-Ukraine war. We're doing the exact same kinds of things that are blinding to what's really going on, lying about what's going on, so that we're pursuing policies that can only fail. And of course, there's now thousands of people paying for their lives with this one. These are much worse, in my view. And I don't know, maybe that's not where you want to go, Kelly, but just wanted to mention that.
No, I was gonna ask you, that kind of dovetails with one of our questions in the Q&A. This came in a little while ago, Matt, when we were talking about elections and how anti-war sentiment or popular sentiment growing against U.S. policies, military policies abroad can actually affect an election. And Vincent DeStefano asks, he says, based on what Matt just said, how will the situation in Gaza and Ukraine affect the upcoming election in November? Do we have popular sentiment that could actually move elections, or are we so politically divided that like both sides are canceling each other out? How do you feel about the elections and foreign policy?
Well, first, let me thanks Vinny. Vinny, for people who know Vinny is the national director for the Assange defense campaign here in the U.S. So entirely appropriate person to, yeah. But thanks, Vinny. I think with regards to, say, the Ukraine war, even though most Americans seem to be disinclined to support it. They're not hostile towards it, but there's not a fervent belief in it as there may have been 2 years ago. I think with the Ukraine war, though, this gets to the idea of identity politics, within the Democratic Party base, there is an identity aspect to it, where this war, as you brought up, Kelly, was used to establish our role in a greater struggle of good versus evil. Right. And this is a very Manichaean, it's also very binary, us versus them. And that even though the American public writ large may have dropped off of their support for the Ukraine war, within the Joe Biden base, there is a great deal of support for the Ukraine war. And so I think that the domestic political calculations are that what we need to do is to keep that going in terms of our support for the war, to keep our base motivated, right? To keep them alive with this spirit of us versus them, good versus evil. And you see that, I think, in September when Joe Biden launches his first campaign ad, and that campaign ad is of him visiting Ukraine. So you can see the Biden campaign at that point saying, this is important to us, even though public opinion was dropping. Americans at that point, certainly by September, more than half of Americans said we shouldn't send any more aid to Ukraine. Right? I mean, so you have that, and then with Gaza in Israel, with Palestine and Israel, I think the Biden administration's calculation was that whatever votes we lose here, 3, 4, 5, 6 million progressive votes, who are upset because we are, taking part in this genocide, not just supporting it, but really you look at the scale and the scope of U.S. support for it. We're taking part. We're not simply supporting it. That the calculation, I think, by the Biden campaign, the White House, was that the loss of those millions of votes is not equal to the loss of support from the Israel lobby, and that the loss of support from the Israel lobby would be devastating to our campaign, not just our campaign, but would be devastating down ballot as well, because we'd see a significant loss of support, on both the federal level, but also on state and local levels that way as well. Yeah, exactly. If it's with these lobbies, and whether it's the Israel lobby or it's big pharma, it's the same thing. We have a problem well above those individual lobbies, in the sense that we have a political system of legalized bribery. And so you have a carrot and stick, and the carrot is either money for your campaign, and the stick is money for the other guy's campaign. Mm-hmm. And so the idea to the Biden administration, I think their calculation was that we can afford to lose these progressive votes. We can't afford to lose the support, the contributions that we will, if we are deemed to be outside the favor of the Israel lobby. Now, that calculation to a lot of people is really starting to look like it's off, right? That they made the wrong calculation, that they are going to pay heavily in the polls. We'll see what happens in the primaries tonight. Wisconsin had a big effort to vote, I think, as they called it, uninstructed out there to vote that protest vote against Joe Biden. But we will see whether or not the calculation was correct to stay in the good graces of the lobby as opposed to staying in the good graces of the progressive voters. And I think this war, this genocide, has gone on much longer than the Biden administration thought it would. I think they thought it would have been over by Christmas, which is a great fallacy of so many wars, right? It'll be over by Christmas. And the fact that it's still hanging on. And I think also, too, these people still don't fully understand the ability that comes from technology like we are talking right now. They are still tied to traditional media. And they believe that as long as we have MSNBC and the New York Times and Fox and the Washington Post on our side, then we will be able to control the narrative. And what we've seen is that, according to polling last week by Gallup, 55% of Americans are opposed to Israeli military operations. And some folks may say it should be, much greater than that. I agree. But when you take the context of it, you take a traditional American media that still, everything I just said, still has an enormous amount of input into what Americans know. You take that media that is heavily biased in favor of a pro-Israel narrative, and then you take American politicians, almost all of whom, and that's not hyperbole or exaggeration, almost all of whom are reading from AIPAC talking points, reading from a pro-Israel lobby script. You say, holy cow, 55% of Americans are opposed to this. Even with all that, what would it be like if you had members of Congress who were willing to actually speak honestly about this? Or what would it be like if you had a traditional media that wasn't beholden to a pro-Israel narrative? Where would the opposition be? And we look, I think our numbers would look a lot like you see in the rest of the world compared to the U.S.
What do you think, Danny, in terms of the impact of either of these conflicts on the upcoming presidential election?
Well, I think it's going to have an impact, and I think that you're already starting to see some changes from the Democratic Party already. You're seeing now some changes from Trump, especially in regard to the Israeli one, because the revulsion from, like Matt just talked about, the image is not controlled by mainstream media, but by social media, which comes across, whether it's, Twitter and some of these others, Telegram, et cetera. They're unfiltered. So they get to see what's going on, and they see that a lot of the stuff they're being told is just nonsense, or that it's like one sliver of the story, and not the whole thing. And so people are turning against it. And I'll be interested in seeing that Wisconsin vote tonight too, see if that continues the pattern of Minnesota and Michigan, and how much that's going to change the dynamics for the Biden administration. You have seen them moderate their actions, and they started taking a lot more forceful moves against Netanyahu, especially when we started getting into the Rafah area, simultaneous with those protest votes going on, because they knows that could end up changing them. And even Trump the other day was not as enthusiastic behind what the Israelis hoped that he would say than I think that they desired, and it was just kind of tepid support. And then the other one, the Russia-Ukraine war, so far people hadn't been much movement on that, because I think the belief among many of the elites is that they could just hang on with its frozen conflict on the line of contact at least through November, and then they can say whatever they want because it's not going to change. That's a big gamble, because I'm starting to see evidence that the Ukraine army is in danger of breaking, and they may not be able to maintain that. And you want to talk about an electoral loser? If the White House refuses to make a negotiated settlement, refuses to push in that direction, like they're trying to push for, the ceasefire, for example, in Israel, and all of a sudden that collapses, and now Russia starts genuinely rolling into areas right then, and Kharkiv gets in danger of falling, and possibly Odessa later in the year. I mean, those things happen, and it's going to turn everything upside down, because now then they're all going to look to Biden and say, your policies failed. You had a chance to do stuff earlier and get this off the table, and you refused to do it. Now you've got a literal crisis on your hand, because Biden will come under double pressure. One, to make a negotiated settlement, get it off the table before the election, and then the other one to escalate it and to get it up higher, to say, oh my God, we can't let Putin win. That's what you're going to hear a lot of. And then now you have the risk of actual escalation and drawing us into a war that is like nothing we've seen in a generation. And that's what I worry most about.
Right. And the other aspect for that with Biden is if he does, quote, lose Ukraine, unquote, right? That's on top of him having lost Afghanistan, right? I mean, something we all disagree with in terms of how that's framed, but in terms of for political framing, he lost Afghanistan, now he lost Ukraine. I mean, so I agree with Danny what he's saying there about the possibility of escalation.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I know that I know, Danny, you kicked up a little fuss in the chat because there are folks that are wondering why you think Ukraine can't win. And I know that's subject for probably another hour-long conversation. But
well, come check out my channel, because I have a lot of stories where you can get all the detail you want. I don't have to say it all again here, but believe me, the fundamentals are there in a way we don't like.
Yeah,
we saw those fundamentals in Afghanistan, to bring us back to the subject here. I mean, like, it just was the same type of evidence that you can see in the fact, however you want to express it, whether it is, this idea that you put troops into an area. And this is the whole concept of counterinsurgency. You put troops into an area, and then those troops are going to take hits. There's going to be enemy action. But over time, those troops are going to, one, win the population over, and then that will weaken support for their insurgency. And what we saw continually over and over again, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, was that was not the case. There's no example of that. And even President Obama says it. You go to Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, and he says this in the book. He says this to Petraeus and McChrystal and others who are pushing this escalation of the war, this this, even though we've been doing counterinsurgency in Afghanistan really since we got there, but this is part of the narrative. This is part of the framing. This is part of the propaganda push that we're gonna do counterinsurgency. We were doing it all wrong before, but now we got it figured out. And we're gonna do right. I mean, so it was that was another lie, right? Another lie. But Obama says to these generals, he says, "Show me where this has worked." And they can't, of course. But then, of course, Obama goes along with it because he's boxed in. He's got no options. He's got.
Well, he had options. He just didn't take them.
Well, he had no political. He had no. Yeah, exactly. He certainly had options. It'd be interesting to sit down with him and talk to him about that. But it was the political options. I think the Pentagon came at him hard. For people who remember when he escalates the war in the fall, he'd already escalated the war. And this is another aspect that people, right? I mean, so when he comes into office, there's 30,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. There's about 15,000 NATO troops and about an equivalent number of contractors. Within a year and a half, there's 100,000 U.S. troops, 40,000 NATO troops, and 100,000 contractors. It's a 250,000 man army that Obama puts in Afghanistan, essentially. He's presented with this idea of escalating the war in the fall by General McChrystal and General Petraeus, and they present him solely with large, medium, and small escalations, and he throws them back at him, and he says, he makes them come back, but they come back with the same plans essentially. And I mean, so he was never really given any options. He's got his Secretary of State who is dead set for escalation of the war for domestic political reasons. She believes, again, the Democratic Party this is a chance for the Democrats to be seen as better war fighters than the Republicans. He's got, a Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, who doesn't want to do anything to upset the Pentagon. No fingerprints, Bob. So he's doing everything he can to maintain his own fiefdom there. I mean, so there's nobody who's offering any type of resistance. As I said, when Holbrooke and Eikenberry told me, like, they're not allowed to talk, basically, in these briefings. Joe Biden supposedly gets credit for being against the war, but the reality is he wasn't against it. The smallest level of escalation offered by the Pentagon was 40,000 troops to President Obama in the fall of 2009. Joe Biden said, let's do 20,000. That was Joe Biden's escalation, right? And Obama chose to do 30,000. So you're talking about a difference of, we would have had 90,000 troops there rather than 100,000.
The reason why I say that there were options, I published one. I published it. It's still out there on the line right now. I said, go big or go deep. And I said that if you go in a big surge, it's going to be disastrous. I published, I think it was October of 2009. So before he made the decision, and a lot of it was based on conversations with Matt, frankly. But I said, if you do, here's what's going to happen. And nearly everything I warned about in there happened. At least 70% of it bad happened. And instead, I said we need to withdraw the majority of our forces and maybe go on these, special forces kind of things on targeted operations if they're against the United States. But he had options, but who's he going to listen to? Some, I think, I was a lieutenant colonel at that time, or all of his 4-star generals, and well, we know how that turned.
Well, I mean, I can tell you two stories about that type of what they were hearing. So when I resign and I'm on television running my mouth and everything else, and I have to go see Chuck Hagel and David Boren, both former senators, both have been senior on the Senate Intelligence Committee. They were both part of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board at that point, and they were both at universities, Hagel at Georgetown, Boren at Oklahoma. And what they wanted to know, what they want to know from me is, how come what we hear you say matches up, Matt, with what we're hearing from the captains, the majors, the colonels who are coming through our schools who just got back from Afghanistan? How come what you're saying and these officers are saying is not what the president is getting on his desk? And then, not long after I had to go and testify to the PAB, I went and gave a briefing to Ike Skelton. This was March 2010. And Skelton at that point was the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. So the most senior member of Congress, right, responsible to the American people for the armed services, for the war, essentially. And I go in there and I give Chairman Skelton my briefing on Afghanistan. And he says to me, thank you for coming in. No one has ever come into this office before and given me a negative briefing on Afghanistan. And that was in 2010 from the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And I can tell you a dozen other stories like that, right?
Yeah.
Where,
Wow.
So, you have this real aspect of what are these men and women who are in power actually being told. But then there's also the domestic political calculations. And so I'm briefing the entire Democratic House caucus. John Murtha, who tragically died in December in 2009. John Murtha was a Vietnam veteran. He was the first Democratic member of Congress to really go against the war, to reverse himself on the Iraq War, and he is dead set against the Afghan War. And he brings me in November of 2009 to speak to the entire House Democratic caucus. And Murtha and I say our spiel, and the House members are excited, and they are lining up 6, 7, 8 deep behind the microphones to say their piece on this, which is essentially, we can't go along with this war. This is just like Iraq. It's just like Vietnam. We can't go along with this. And then at some point after 20 minutes of this goes on, Speaker Pelosi pops up, and, it's her prerogative to speak. And she says, I hear what you're saying. I agree with you about this war. However, we have to remember what is the president's priority. We cannot paint him into a corner. And if people remember, November 2009, the House had literally just passed the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. The week before this meeting, it was going on to the Senate. And the Speaker of the House was telling these members of Congress, okay, I agree with you on this war. It's a mistake. We are dooming thousands of our young people to go over there to die for nothing. But the president's priority is the Affordable Care Act, and that is where we have to put our support, and we can't confront him on this now, right? I mean, we saw this over and over again. I mean, I could tell you a dozen stories like that, but that's the reality of Washington, D.C., politics of it.
Wow.
Yeah, that is so unfortunate.
I guess I can't say I'm surprised, but I had no idea that you'd done that part. Somehow I'd missed those stories, but yikes.
Well, you wonder what's going on today, because, at one level you have members of Congress who are urging President Biden to condition the weapons that he's giving to Israel. And they're going out and they're doing interviews with Al Jazeera and other places, Democracy Now!, whatever, basically saying that they're concerned that Israel is not abiding by international law and that we are feeding it with all of our weapons and aid. But on the other hand, there has been, the number of members who actually come out for ceasefire, who actually come out with bills or resolutions that would maybe, you know, tighten the purse strings a little bit, with that, which they have the power to do. Not so much. So you wonder how much pressure is on, and I would imagine an enormous amount of pressure on the Democratic caucus in both the Senate and the House side for not for just what you said, for painting Biden into a corner.
Right.
And it really handcuffs them from actually representing the people. As you point out, a growing majority of Americans want what's going on in Gaza to stop. So who are they serving? Us, or, you know, the Democratic Party machinery?
Right. And you know, makes it even more obscene, if you will. 80% of their party membership wants an end to it. Right. So it's
Right.
not like that the Republicans but even the majority of the Republicans want an end to what's going on in Gaza, if I've got my numbers correct. Right. I mean, so but this gets back to that idea of how our political system is a system of you know, legalized bribery, to put it simply and frankly. And until we fix that, you know, like my friend Mike Ferner, who's the director of Veterans for Peace, says, we're just, you know, chasing around these arsonists with buckets of water, right? As opposed to taking the matches away from them, you know, and all we do is run ourselves ragged chasing after them when, you know, it's a being reactionary like this. We can only expect in the future to continue to have these same conversations about future wars because that's the trajectory we're on.
Yeah. Danny, I have a quick question now that I have you in front of me. But, you know, when I see the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, asked about what's going on in Gaza today, I don't know about you, but I feel like he is kind of trying to insert some caution and warning between the lines when he's talking to reporters. I feel like for some reason, I don't know why it's projecting out to me, that he actually gets it, that what Israel is doing is going to be very destructive to Israel as well as the Palestinians on the ground. And it seems like he's issued a number of warnings as only he could. He's limited in what he can say, obviously. My question to you is, do you think the U.S. military is less sanguine about the U.S. policy with Israel right now, because they see how this could probably ignite a greater war in the Middle East?
Yeah.
It would have this destructive blowback to the U.S. military in the Middle East, or are they just sort of like, you know, we're doing what we got to do? I mean, do you get any sense from the inside how they feel?
Yeah, I don't have any current context in the Department of Defense right now. They've all kind of vanished, and not many people talk to me, though I do have some. But the core issue that you're talking about here is something that I've been harping on from the outset: is that the policy that Netanyahu set himself upon with military power to try to achieve the political outcome that he seeks, peace for Israel, is impossible. As a matter of fact, he is creating far more, and really for the same kind of reasons that Matt and I talked about in both Iraq and Afghanistan over the years. The same thing, except on steroids. They are killing so many people, so many innocent people here, that whatever Hamas fighters you may think that you're taking out, and by the way, especially in this Rafah issue, when they say they're going to get the final 4 battalions, whatever that even means. It's not like they're in uniforms that you can go identify who's a Palestinian man or who's just a Hamas fighter, that you can take this one out and leave that one. They are killing so many people that the anger and the hatred for Israel right now, I can tell you for certain, is off the charts. If we thought that the pressure that was on the Palestinian people prior to October 7th is what caused them to take this terrorist act, or what initiated it because of their desperation, that's nothing compared to what they'll have now. These people are not just going to go passive once Netanyahu declares that he's killed these 4 battalions. So they are putting themselves on a path. We are providing ammunition and weapons to enable them to go on a path that will create far more enemies for Israel than ever they have taken off the course here. And they're buying a generation of insecurity for their people, worse than anything they've had in the last 25 years.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're in uncharted territory, because at some level it will blow back on the United States, because we have cleaved ourselves so closely to Netanyahu's policies, and Biden refuses to extricate or
Oh,
use any of
plus,
its.
Kelly, I mean, look, you had Israel attack the Syrian army on the 28th of March and kill 40 of them. Now then they've destroyed an embassy, which is unheard of in any world affairs. And now then they're just begging Syria, Iran, all these other groups to strike back. I don't know what they're genuinely thinking, if they actually want them to strike back to start another war. Israel, I don't know, but I know that that's where they're heading on. And we're complicit in all this. And if it blows up, then it's going to draw us into it as well. And like I said, in Ukraine, that's my big worry, is escalation. And Israel is on a path that we're enabling that could draw us into a war.
I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'll just bring it back to the anti-war movement, whistleblowing. We have a question. Now I lost it, but I remember what it was, but I wanted to give the person credit for it. They had asked, what should, and I don't have a name. What goals should anti-war activists focus on so that Americans can have accurate information about our foreign policy? This is all about information from beginning to end of our conversation, is how do we get the word out there and counteract the propaganda and the lies that are being spread by the war party, and specifically our government. Like, what can we do so that we're not just toiling at the edges trying to get the truth out? Are there other ways that activists, but also journalists in our camp, or truth tellers like yourselves, how do we kind of harness like the moment and try to be more effective on convincing people that they're being lied to, and in order to get them to vote with their feet?
You bet. You want to go first?
I think, one of the things we look at the public opinion for these wars for the last couple of decades, really for all American wars since World War II. And the wars tend to start out quite popular, and then they lose their popularity. And in the last decade, they've lost popularity very quickly. And whether these are direct wars or proxy wars. And part of that is the moral foundering, right? That these wars fall under under the weight of their immorality, of their own failures, of their how counterproductive they are, etc. But the other is that as people understand it, they become more confident in asserting their opinion. And one of the things with like the technology we have now with alternative and independent media is it allows people to confirm their understandings, their suspicion. Because, without alternative and independent media, if you're forced to rely watching Barry McCaffrey on MSNBC or Jack Keane on Fox News, I'm sorry to agitate you, Kelly, but like if that's what you're forced to rely upon, and you're seeing the Chiron says for retired general, all these different things, and that person is telling you you're wrong, you don't get it, no, that's not what it actually is. Well, then it creates a dissonance or a lack of confidence, and you don't follow up on it. You don't assert yourself on it. You don't speak out about it. You don't act on it. But when you have independent and alternative media that is able to confirm what people believe, right? So you see, and I'm not talking about experts or talking heads like Danny and I are now, but in the case of, say, Gaza, able to see the footage coming out of there, right? That confirms to people what they understand is occurring. And so that ability for independent and alternative media to then have a galvanizing effect on a movement and to inform people, as well as to let people know that they are in solidarity with others. That's the thing that the public opinion would shock people, say in December of 2013 with the Afghan War, when the Afghan War becomes the most unpopular war in American history. In December 2013, 80% of Americans are against the Afghan War. 80%. higher than the Iraq War ever was, higher than the Vietnam War ever was. And I think if you asked Americans at the time, they'd be shocked to know that. But everyone, whether or not people knew that other people agreed so vehemently with them as to how this war should be opposed, or how this war is not worth fighting, or how it was a mistake, whatever the question is. So I think that is what I come back to, is we need to continue to build, we need to reinforce, we need to support, we need to follow independent and alternative media so that people are able to understand what's occurring. People have transparency. There's one more stat. 2 weeks ago, Pew polling had a number, only 52% of Americans knew that more Palestinians had been killed than Israelis have been killed in the last 6 months. And you might say that, well, how is that possible? You get it. It's one of those things where there's a duality to it. It's terrible that people are that ignorant about the war, that half of Americans don't know who has been who've been killed over there, Palestinians, Israelis. But there's also an opportunity, right? There's an opportunity to educate. There's an opportunity to inform. And when you educate and inform people, that gives you the ability to organize and mobilize people. And then if you can build it to the level that we saw in 2006, 2008, 2016, now you are subverting, now you are overthrowing the edge that the corporations have, the media have, the lobbyists have, because you are directly challenging the power of those people who are in office. And that's what they're most concerned about. Our people in power, whether they're Republican or Democrat, the means to them are the ends, right? Power is everything, and that's what they care about. And so if you're able to affect that, then you're able to affect that policies, and you're able to end wars. The problem being, as I said earlier, we have to be very careful because the empire evolves. And so you go from having direct wars to proxy wars, but that's a hurdle for us to fight as well. Yeah.
I have nothing to add to that. That's brilliant. Can't hear you, Kelly.
Another important aspect of this before we go is amplifying each other's work. So you might write something, Matthew and Daniel, you have your show, I'm writing, I'm trying my best. I'm on X as much as I can promoting our work, but I also try to promote others' work in independent media and these other voices. And if we're banging it around, we look even we look even bigger in terms of our collective voices than maybe we even are. And we're getting people where they're at, whether it be on YouTube or online or in other podcasts or what have you, and in different audiences like veterans audiences, anti-war left, anti-war right. And I think we got to keep the solidarity among each other and continue to promote each other's work. Because, as my boss, Trita Parsi, said when he was founding the Quincy Institute, he said, listen, the neocons got this down. They have maybe a handful of magazines and think tank journals or whatever, and they just promote the hell out of each other. And they make sure they're all on panels, and then they're promoting each other's panels, and they're constantly talking about each other. So it just looks like they're this they got this huge megaphone and they're everywhere. They're ubiquitous. And he says, I want to do that for the non-interventionist, rest of the world, meaning both left and right.
Right.
And I think that's what we should be doing. So, and on programs like this. So I'd like to, I know we went over a few minutes, and I want to thank you, Matthew and Daniel, for all your sage words, your advice, your recollections, just your commentary about how much more work we have to do. I'm so glad to be on your team, and I'm so glad that the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy was able to give us a platform to talk about these issues, because it's so important, and just the institution of, I say institution of whistleblowers, and keeping the tenets of truth and risking everything for the truth, and keeping that alive, doing the right thing. So thank you, and thank you to our audience who joined us. Sorry I didn't get to all your questions. I know there seemed to be a vigorous debate over Ukraine in the chat, happy to provide a forum for that too. But thank you, and I'm sure, and I think Christian might be coming back on. I'm not sure if he wants to advertise any upcoming events for you to make sure that folks are on. There's
No,
Christian.
just thank you all for a great, lively and wide-ranging discussion. It was a pleasure to have you. Our next event will be on April 8th, and you can look it up on our website. So thanks so much.